I'll go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Keleman. I work at American Farmland Trust. I'm a New England soil health specialist. And I'm really grateful that you all decided to spend some time with us tonight. Sean, you're next.
Hi, I'm Sean Hagan. I work for Maine Farmland Trust. I work as a farmland protection project manager and a climate adaptation project manager doing climate adaptation plans with farms. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. And before working for Maine Farmland Trust, I was farming in Maine for a number of years, and we'll talk a little bit about that site as well. So Neil, want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Neil Foley. I'm a farmer in Mid-Coast Maine, dairy farmer. My wife and I have a small herd of Jersey cows, and Allison is a cheesemaker. So we are grass-based and very weather dependent.
And you'll get to hear more about Neil's farm and see some pictures later. But without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we are here today to talk about climate adaptation planning for flooding and high precipitation conditions. So I am first going to take some time to just talk about what climate adaptation planning is and how you do it. And then Sean's going to get into some more specifics about some tools you can use when you're thinking about the risks that are specific to your site. And then Neil and I are going to have kind of a Q&A type conversation about the climate adaptation planning that he's done on his farm. Okay, what is climate adaptation planning? I like to think of it as, just another type of planning. We all do life planning in some either, kind of formal or informal way. We do financial planning. If you have other examples of types of plans, either farm or otherwise, that you do, you can stick them in the chat. And this, much like any other type of planning, is just a process that you use. It's a heuristic. It's like a set of steps that you can use to scaffold the experience of thinking about climate change a little bit more, with a little bit more intention than I think we normally do. So it's a process for considering risks and the way you might mitigate those risks. And it's a cycle. It's something that you can come back to many times, depending on the outcomes that you're seeing and the risks that you're feeling. And why do we do climate adaptation planning? Adaptation is a part of life. It's something that we do all the time. And so being intentional about it can help the pain points along the way feel a little bit less like pain and a little bit more like, oh, I'm not going to freak out. I know what I'm doing here. This word cloud on the right is from a former grad student lab mate colleague of mine, Sara Delaney, who is looking at a group of farmers who have made their own climate adaptation plans and asking them to reflect on what they got out of the plan. And I think that one thing that is interesting to point out here, and we're thinking about, is like, you're not going to show up to a what is climate adaptation planning presentation unless you are already thinking about it a little bit. So it's really more of like a great way to help you follow through on a project you already had in mind, or expand something that you've been kind of fostering for a little while, improve a system that you already know is going to be important. Other words here like start, change the conversation, make it more efficient. So it's not, I'm not here to like convince anyone that this is something that they need to do if they didn't think they needed to do it. I think this is just an interesting way to think about how you can look at what you have. It's a stopping inflection point. You stop, you take stock, you look at what the future might hold, and then you can find the resources and support that you need to move forward. What does it look like? This is also from Sara Delaney, looking at the practices that farmers who were a part of a cohort where they were working with an advisor to create a climate adaptation plan after the fact, reflecting on the changes they make. What were the adaptation practices that they chose? And you can see that a majority of the people in the cohorts chose either soil or water management strategies as their adaptation strategies. I wish the infrastructure was on here. I think it kind of it's like a part of a bunch of these categories. And I think it would be really interesting to see infrastructure on here as well, because I think that's another one where people focus a lot of their time and energy. But generally, for the most part, this is like 2/3 people thinking about improving their soil and water management systems on their farms. And I think that's because those tend to be kind of the low-hanging fruit in a lot of ways. They're like a little bit less intimidating to take on. It's kind of like a no regrets type decision. You can see the benefits and know that you're improving your soil health and your climate resilience at the same time, or your water flow on your farm and your climate resilience at the same time. So it's interesting to look at. Okay, what are the steps? Oh, and one other thing I wanted to say about this. So when we think about what climate adaptation looks like, you can think about it in kind of like small chunks. Like it's a continuum. So there are short-term activities that you can do, and maybe it's an incremental change towards a larger, more substantive wholesale type change that you want to do. Some sort of transformation maybe of your business or of the land that you steward. And I kind of think of the little chunks as stepping stones that can kind of inform a longer term strategy, or you're like a learning by doing type of approach to either climate adaptation or the land that you steward. So it's both a long-term and a short-term process, and the little pieces make up the bigger whole. Okay, these are the steps of the climate adaptation planning process, kind of in their simplest form. So I'm going to talk through every step of this cycle. We're first identify goals, then understand the climate impacts that are going to affect you most, conduct a risk assessment for your farm, make the adaptation plan, and then monitor and evaluate, reassess, and then you can start the whole thing over again. So we're going to step through. So first step is set your goals. What are the overall or immediate goals of your farm operation? These don't have to be climate specific, in my opinion. I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we think about climate change and climate adaptation outside of the context of our business, our life and livelihood. Like, are we enjoying our life on the farm? And we should instead kind of be like integrating climate into everything instead of separating it out. So my pitch is these should be farm goals, not specifically climate goals. And yeah, so they're thinking about your foundational values, financial requirements, strengths, resources, aspirations, challenges, etc. So these, I'm going to show you some goals that I've seen from people. Financial stability, healthcare, and having some buffer savings. Creating and using a plan for flood events on the farm. That one's kind of farm specific, but it's also, that's like a part of a bigger business plan. Steward our land and soil for the next generation. That's a pretty big goal. Commit to experimenting with cover crops every year. That's a smaller goal. So again, some people go kind of grand, some go small, but it's a nice way to figure out how, once you start identifying strategies, you can kind of like check in with yourself and see if the strategies that you're coming up with are meeting the needs that you expressed in your goals. The next thing you're going to do is look at your climate impacts. What have you observed or experienced on your farm? What's forecasted in your state or county or town, depending on how local you can get your data for the future. This screenshot is from a tool that my coworker at American Farmland Trust, Julie Fine, put together, where you can kind of just check things off and do it that way. You can also kind of get deeper into the data if you want to. And if you're interested in hyperlocal climate data, you can either watch the recording from last week where I think Sean Burkle knows a lot of stuff about what's coming and how and what we should expect. Or if you have a question and you don't know where to find the information, feel free to get in touch with me. I can help you out with that. But I just want to briefly do the climate impacts talk, which is because we are seeing an increase in temperature globally. When we see this increase in temperature, a 1 degree increase in temperature creates a 7% increase in the amount of water that the atmosphere can hold. And the intensification of the water cycle isn't going to mean that there's more precipitation everywhere. It's going to kind of just shift precipitation patterns. But what it will mean in the Northeast is that we're going to see more extreme precipitation events, changes in water availability, altered pest and weed life cycles. It's going to get hotter, so that's going to be harder for farm workers, farmers, livestock, and depending on where you are, these impacts might even reduce property values. The list goes on. It's a bummer, but we can handle it. Warming temperatures, we've already seen a 3 degree increase since 1900, and we're expecting another 5 to 11 by 2099, so by the end of the century, and that's going to get hotter faster because we're still kind of catching up with past emissions. The Earth cycles move slowly, so we're still calibrating to emissions in the past, and we're still emitting more greenhouse gases, so temperature is going to go up. All seasons are warming, winters are warming faster. We're seeing more spatial variation and kind of these temperature swings and longer frost-free periods with fewer freeze days during the winter. And we're also seeing more heat waves in the summertime. In terms of precipitation, we're seeing an increased total annual precipitation across the region between 2 and 20% since 1901. More of the precipitation we're getting is falling during these really big storm events. And because we're getting more of our precipitation during these really big events, that means that the water that we get over the year is not spread out nice and evenly. So we might still get, even if it's not technically called a drought, we might still get like agricultural drought type conditions that we have to contend with, even though we're getting more water every year in our region. So that's my quick. Those are the climate impacts that you can think about and what's that going to do on your farm. The next step, going back to our 5-point star, is a risk assessment. So based on your observations, thinking about the climate impacts, taking into account the projected change, what major vulnerabilities are there for your farm operation? What areas of land, crops, animals, infrastructure are at risk, and what's a priority to protect if you need to choose? And then reflect back on your goals. So where do the identified climate impacts directly impact your top farm goals? And this is where I say, pull out your phone, take a look through, because you were probably taking pictures of the things that felt like, uh-oh, I need to do something about this. Okay, this is a little small, but this is what a climate risk assessment looks like. This is Neil's climate risk assessment, in fact. So over here in this column, you can see the changing climate pattern that was identified. The next column over is farm impact. So let's use this top row because this is the highest priority that Neil identified. So changing precipitation patterns, wetter, winter, fall, spring. What are the impacts? That's a longer mud season, erosion, saturated soils, standing water. Basically, it's wet. And how do you deal with all of this extra water? Where is it happening? Everywhere, especially roads, pathways, infrastructure, barnyard, and milking parlor. What is it going to do to our business? Infrastructure damage risks, less predictable working conditions, more labor keeping animals dry and healthy, loss of topsoil, nutrient soil nutrient management, runoff and erosion. What might the financial consequences be? Soil quality is reduced, so therefore we see, you know, like yield decreases, and that kind of trickles down into the product. Potential profit loss from infrastructure damage, costs of work delay. And Neil identified this. So Neil was working on this with a partner, Emily McCarthy at Maine Farmland Trust, and together they identified this as the highest priority. And then this is kind of getting into the next step, which is, okay, so what are we going to do about it? Here's another farm. This is a vegetable farm, and they identified extreme precipitation as a risk. This is just a different version of the spreadsheet. I'm sorry I'm making you look at spreadsheets, but this is kind of like, this is a spreadsheet thing. So we're looking at some spreadsheets. Because of extreme precipitation, they're seeing ponding, making harvesting and cultivating more difficult, saturated soils making planting difficult, high humidity disease leading to, they saw some pest. And, you know, the list kind of goes on. And then this is the one column that's different here is, what do we already have to address this risk? So where are we starting from, basically? Okay, so then after you do your risk assessment, the next step is an adaptation plan. And there are a couple of steps within the adaptation planning step. So the first one is go big, identify all possible strategies and practices that might work for your top priority thing that you know you want to deal with. Adaptive practices should be flexible, meaning you can kind of implement them and then learn and pivot and change. You should prioritize no regrets decisions that will create benefits with little risk. So like soil health, use resources that are available to you and give yourself a timeline. And then the second step is to prioritize and decide what you actually are going to do. So there are a couple ways to think about adapting, like what an adaptive strategy looks like. One is to protect. So you're protecting existing practices that you already do or kind of enhancing them. So adding additional irrigation. Adapt, for example, growing drought tolerant varieties. I think this example, which is, you know, deciding that he decided he was going to scale up his cover cropping and figure out how to plant into his terminated cover cropping. That feels like that's a this one. Adapt. Transform. Are you going to totally change the kind of like landscape of your farm or the way that you farm or even where you farm as an adaptive strategy? Here is a nice table of possible adaptation strategies and practices. This is big, and it's kind of broad because it's for both vegetable and livestock farmers. And also, you know, because everyone's context is different, not all of these might be appropriate in every climate. And also, it's fun and exciting to kind of think outside the box too. So this is not meant to be prescriptive. This is just kind of like, these are the strategies, these are the practices, and you can take what you want and leave the rest, or think of something else that might work for you. It's like going to the library, you browse, maybe you take something home, maybe you just leave inspired. Okay, so we're going back to Neil's plan now. So this is evaluating the potential practices. So Neil's putting together an adaptation plan based on that risk assessment. So based on the additional precipitation, the idea here is, okay, let's choose some things that might help with that. So swale design, on-farm hydrology plan, barnyard drainage and terracing, and, you know, how well might this idea mitigate the risk that I have identified? How expensive will it be? Is there anything else we should think about? And when do I want to do it? And then you can give yourself a gut check. Do I want to do this or not? Yes or no? this is from the vegetable farm, another example. So again, we're looking at potential adaptation strategies for extreme precipitation. Do we want to install culverts? That would be really expensive. Do we want to add more raised beds? Maybe. They already know how to do it, so that would be an easy thing to do. So you're just kind of being exhaustive in coming up with strategies and then talking yourself through what it would actually look like to implement them. Here's another way to look at it. If you're not a spreadsheet person, maybe this is the way you want to do it. You put the risk at the top. Then you say, okay, what's my strategy? And finally, what are the practices that might get me there? So if there's too much trouble with the heirloom tomatoes, maybe we want to think about diversification, changing our infrastructure, changing our cropping strategies, and kind of write those all out. So if we were to diversify, what would that look like? Could we add a high tunnel that would be for late season heirloom tomatoes, or do we want to trial heirloom hybrids? These are 3 possible strategies to deal with this risk. Okay, next step, and the last step in the kind of 5 points of doing your climate adaptation planning is monitor, and I would add evaluate. This little graphic, again, is from the tool that I'll share with you. But basically, the questions that we're asking is, how do you know you're successful? And how often will you measure to see if you're successful? You can look. And this is a picture. I showed a picture a while back of a bunch of rows on a vegetable farm where there was a lot of ponding. You saw a lot of standing water. Now there is no standing water. Visually, that's better. You can look here and say, okay, before the soil wasn't covered and now it is. Visually, that's better. I can watch the infiltration happening more effectively. You can collect data. So for the tomato example we were talking about, you can measure income from heirloom tomatoes as a % of the total. You want to decrease that to 30. So that's for diversification. We want to say, okay, if we're finding something else to fill that niche, we want to decrease our financial reliance on this crop we know is going to be affected by climate risks. Or increase the percentage of heirloom production in a high tunnel to 20% of the total, trial for hybrids, track yield. So basically, this is just like a request that, or a suggestion that when you're trying something new, you always want to be kind of keeping track of it. And casually is fine, but collecting data is nice too, because you can really check your work. And yeah, this is just one more way. So this is the timeline. How will you know if it's effective? When will you know if it's effective? What do you need to measure, and what tools do you need to measure? So these are kind of questions that you can be asking yourself so you will know whether or not you're succeeding. And then rinse and repeat and share with others. I think that it can be really valuable to do this with someone else, whether that's a service provider or a business partner or another farmer who has a similar farm to you, or similar, your brains kind of work in a similar way, because it can be really exhausting to gather all of the information you need to do this. And also, it's easy to stall out and be like, I don't have time and I need to go get some stuff done right now. And this plan can feel a little bit frivolous maybe, but when you can get into the mindset of thinking proactively about climate change, and then an event happens and you feel more prepared, I think that might make it worth it. I don't know. Maybe Neil will tell us if that makes it worth it. And this is, kind of like, this is what we're going for. You need to prioritize, think about how you can be flexible, think, what are my no regrets decisions? What have I been meaning to do for a while that I know will also improve my climate resilience? take precautionary actions. If you see a risk coming and you recognize it as a risk, it is a risk. And how can you work to deal, like crossing your fingers and closing your eyes probably isn't going to help. So what else can we do? Think about mitigation where you can, if that's something that you're comfortable with and something that kind of fits into your plan for your farm. How can you reduce your energy footprint? And think about an emergency plan. Is it possible to be saving a little bit of extra money for an emergency account? Have you thought about the way that your buildings are insured? You know, that kind of stuff. And that this all will get you where you need to go. There are a whole bunch of tools, worksheets, spreadsheets, workbooks, that kind of thing that can help you through this process, that'll give you a place to put your ideas. This one is really good if you're kind of like a visual learner. This one is full of worksheets. This is a spreadsheet-based tool, and this again is kind of worksheets. This will take you less time than this one for sure. And so it's up to you to decide what level of complexity you want to address this at. And I'll put links to all of these in the chat as Sean is talking. And look, here's some links right here too. So these will get you to those pages. And with that, I will pass it over to Sean.
Thanks, Sarah. All right. Yeah, as Sarah said, she had the bit of a hard job of trying to present a bunch of spreadsheets to get through the explaining the adaptation process. But what I'm going to talk about is jumping into that middle piece of evaluating the risks and potential strategies that go along with what you're seeing on your farm, and figuring out how to prioritize what to address. We tend to, I think, when we're on the farm and seeing a bunch of the problems that we could address, it's hard to take a step back and figure out in a more systematic way what are the potential ways I can address these various things. So I'm going to run through a few online tools that are useful to kind of supplement what you're seeing on the ground. Some mapping tools to look at topography and soils and figure out how water's moving on the farm. And hopefully those are a way of better understanding the risks of flood and extreme weather. We'll do two site examples, one a more flat floodplain site, and then we'll take a look at a hillside farm site as well. And I do apologize to the Vermont folks. This is going to be a bit Maine centric in terms of some of these being available for the state of Maine. So you may have to do some Googling to see what the equivalent is available in Vermont. So we'll start with this floodplain site. This is actually where I used to farm in Bodenham, Maine. This sits along Merrymeeting Bay with a number of rivers coming into this bay. It's a tidal bay, and excellent soils, but very susceptible to the potential for flood. This was the land I was farming. It was about 8 acres, and it was around next to another farm. That farm eventually took over the land that I had. So hopefully they're okay with me explaining some of the potential climate impacts that they're also facing on this land. So we're going to just start with Google Earth as a really useful tool to just get an aerial view of the farm. And I'm sure people are familiar with this, but there's a few things that are useful to see sometimes that you don't always think about. One is getting a sense of some vegetation changes and where those happen and what the indications are of how your soils are changing or conditions are changing, and also using the history tool on there to go back and see how things have changed over the course of years. So real quickly, these were some of the climate risks that I saw when I was there, and I know that the current farmers are seeing there. And but how do you assess what the danger is on those, what the probability is that they're going to occur, what the degree of damage will be if they do occur, and then figure out all the potential strategies that you could use to address this. So here, this was a area that was often wet for me. I couldn't get it there in the spring. So if I was trying to do crop rotations, it was a tricky issue. These beds were always wet, and ended up just being ones I really shouldn't have often used for production. This was susceptible to flooding, being right on the bay, another wet area. I know the farmers there now have started to see significant erosion along this bank here, as another example. And then I just want to point this out as an example of where you can start to see some of the vegetation changes just by looking at an aerial. And that's suggesting, obviously it's not a huge impact on this particular farm, but you can see where there might be changes in soil or wetland conditions, and using the indications of changes in vegetation to suggest what is happening with the soil below that. So this is a lot wetter along this line here. Going back in the history, this goes back about 20 years, and you can see it was a lot more of a larger production farm. They did lots of carrots and root crops here, as opposed to the very diversified farm it is now. And even farther back, 30 years, still doing a lot larger production. But one thing that is interesting to note is the direction of the bed are all going kind of diagonally here. And this area that I was always facing with wet beds looks like it wasn't even farmed. And so when did that go under production? Was it, did they find it to be too wet to use? There weren't roads running through here at that time. And the road was running down here, and certainly on a very flat property, roads can impact how the water is flowing, and small subtle changes can affect the drainage. So useful just to kind of get an idea of how that land has been used over time. Obviously, everybody's familiar with web soil survey to be able to dive into the types of soils you have. But I always recommend people do more digging in here than initially they might do. This property that I was on had excellent prime farmland soils, and looking at the properties, typical profile, very good soil in multiple horizons, little slope, water moved well, depth to water table was pretty good. But you will note there was the occasional frequency of flooding. And it's worth noting whether those are rated as hydric soils or not. So these obviously won't be as prime farmland soils, but if you have a farm site that has a number of different soil types all through there, and you start to dig into some of this, you might see where some of those differences are matching up with some of the potential impacts that you're seeing. So I always recommend people really explore this in depth. So just a couple other things, diving into the Soil Data Explorer and looking at soil properties and qualities. You can see, they'll give you the maps with those ratings on various things. So you can look at the susceptibility to compaction, you can look at the available water capacity. This particular map is, I think, just the drainage class. So you've got the well-drained soil that where all the production is happening, but on the edges there, you've got those poorly drained areas, which match up well with what we were seeing on the Google Earth aerial of where those changes in vegetation was happening. And so less an impact on this particular site, but there's plenty of times where people will be farming up against potential wetlands, and where are these lines suggesting that some of those wetland soils are. And you can look up wetland delineations. An easy one in Maine is the ArcGIS online map viewer for wetlands. You know, this gives a general idea again of where the wetlands are. When you get into very specific on the ground delineation, you really need someone out there to help you for a more accurate delineation. But it's useful to look up and see where is it overlaying with those with what your soils are saying, your soil maps are saying, and what you're seeing actually on the ground. So again, this lines up with what we're seeing both on the aerial and in the soil properties. Also, you'll see sometimes on properties where drainage has been put in historically to help drain some of those fields, and they might be mapped as wetlands or mapped as particularly wet soils, and that's been altered by farming over the years. But keep in mind, I think Joshua might have mentioned this as the last talk, now trying to improve drainage anywhere around a wetland can put in danger any potential funding from NRCS. So you always want to be very careful about trying to adjust drainage around a wetland. Topography is very important to understand if you to start to get the nuances of how water is flowing on your property. And a useful way to take a look at that is looking at the 2-foot contours, which are available for the state of Maine. I know they're at least available for parts of Vermont. There's an online ArcGIS online map viewer for these. When we pull that up for that site, we can start to see where water wants to flow and how it moves around this site. So a reminder, water always flows perpendicular to the contours. So here you've got the high point, high being relative, probably about 2 to 3 feet, but higher than the rest of the farm. But water wants to move down into this channel, wants to move down into this channel and out into the bay. But what that starts to show you is how those roads, for example, are disrupting where that water wants to go. And so in a high precipitation event, are where you have roads starting to create dams and altering how water can sit or move. Again, this area that I always found wet was the natural drainage channel for water coming down here and moving out towards the bay. Is it something I just really should have given up on sooner and made into a riparian habitat or a buffer? And where are the flood risks? So this suggests, you know, obviously the low points along the bay, but we can corroborate that with looking at the, so here's just the impediments to flow on the roads, but we can corroborate that potential flooding with the flood zone delineation. So this is the Maine flood hazard map, useful to see those flood zone delineations. And this is the 1% chance of flooding, which take for a grain of salt. It's much higher than that probably at this point. This was also a 2015 delineation on that, but you can see the extent of flooding has a potential into this field here and how far that would move up into these fields. This did flood in the winter of 2024, January 2024, and exacerbated the erosion along this bank. So this has happened in the past couple of years. This is an example. This is a different site, but a similar property along a floodplain farmland. This was really bad erosion along a river. This particular field had not been cover cropped. This is that storm that happened in 2024. Just as a comparison, this is next to it. This is a field that was cover crop, very little erosion that we saw on the same site. But you can see how important just having soil cover is on there. But we know it's in a floodplain, we know it can flood, but to see the impact when you really do get a storm can show you, even if in your mind, the probability isn't that likely, the damage might be significant when it happens. So in kind of conjunction with doing the spreadsheets and getting kind of in depth on all the words, it's useful to just sketch out what the climate impacts are and what the potential solutions can be. So this is just sketched this up for that site, just to put kind of a visual representation of some of the ideas that you could do to adapt to the things that we're seeing on that site. So, you know, increasing the buffer along the bay, on both of those areas where there wasn't one, making sure there's winter cover crops in those areas that could flood, turning this into just a windbreak, and expanding that buffer and taking it out of production because it just isn't that useful, and maybe altering the roads a little bit, improving the roads that we need to because they're washing out, and maybe moving this one so this field just has one road around it. I placed these greenhouses when I was there, but you know, looking back, I had planned on them mainly for summer use, but ended up using for the winter too, and accessing those in the winter. The farther out they are, the harder it is to access, and you get mud and you're increasing compaction. So really should have put them along the main road for easier access and trying to reduce compaction on the soil. In getting to that, you'll also see that the bed direction on this is going this way. I actually had it going the other way, and I think that exacerbated the wet area in the back corner of this. So I think this was an improvement alone that the next farmers did to take this over. So just an example of how you can visualize some of these adaptation strategies, and then start to map out the easier ones to do and the ones that maybe are long-term solutions. Switching gears to a hillside farm site. So this looks a little busy. This is a bit of a zoom in on a site that is a lot steeper and has a lot more potential for erosion, and having to figure out how to work with water drainage. But taking a look just at the contours on a site like this can be really useful to reinforce what you're seeing with how water is moving on the site and what you can do to manipulate that or work with it. So a couple of things I would do in looking at this site is one, figuring out how steep that slope is. So just measuring that, we've got about a 26 foot elevation change over this field, and over a distance of 300 feet. So it's about a 9% slope. And that is kind of in a range of you're starting to get to about 10% slope, where you really want permanent cover on that ground for high precipitation events, where erosion is more likely for anything that's just bare ground. So that can just kind of give you an idea, and it's less steep at the top, and it starts to get more steep at the bottom of this slope. Are there ways that we can slow the water down a little bit before it moves into this area down here, and how water is moving on that site, again, always perpendicular to those contours. So we've got this channel that's right here. This is actually a man-made channel from years ago on this particular field to help with drainage. But so water is going to be moving down this, also coming from the forested land down into that. It would move across this field and add into that drainage channel. There's another one on this side. But there's seeing those arrows that are moving all in that one direction, you can start to get an idea of how much water, if that soil is saturated and if we have a really big precipitation event, are going to converge and push significant amounts of soil potentially out of those fields. And so depending on what type of soil you have and what the susceptibility to erosion is going to exacerbate that. So this farm this has certainly helped with their drainage over the years. This was put in years ago, but they do have to rehab this waterway. They do find that erosion does happen and pushes into that channel. Just to reinforce that idea, this is a drainage analysis that we can do. We do sometimes with our climate adaptation plans. This is a flow accumulation map. And so this looks at where water's flowing on that site and maps the channels that would be created over a certain amount. So this particular one is looking at where are the channels that are going to be created for water over the of at least an acre in surface. So it's starting at these little channels and adding into this the larger, darker colors. But you can see that moving right through some of these fields are channels where an acre of surface water is moving and converging. So just kind of reinforces what you may be seeing on your farm, or just being able to map with a contour map. Looking again at the wetland map, you can see there is some wetlands on this particular property. So keeping that in mind, how do we protect those wetlands and buffer the water that are moving in there, any runoff that you would have, fertilizer or anything like that, and protect the natural habitat while potentially having to improve drainage on the farm and balance those two things. So taking that information, putting that together, and again, trying to maybe sketch this out a little bit, you've got your line of a wetland over here. This existing grass waterway that's helping to move water out of the fields. The reason I chose this particular field is you can see where those beds are already on contour. So that's an example of how this farm is trying to slow that water down so that the water is moving along those contour lines very slowly before it hits that grass waterway and moves out. Another way to lessen the amount of water there would be potentially putting a diversion channel at the top of that bed, top of those fields, to prevent any additional water coming in from the top and moving around. And then keeping anything really steep, just always vegetated and everything under all that soil covered as much as possible. So just another example of ways to visualize that and sketch that out, and think about ways to manipulate water or work with the land that you have. These are all those online tools. Very hard to memorize these, but slides will be available, recording will be available, so you'll be able to look those up. Again, apologies to the Vermont folks that you may need to do some Googling. Just the last thing before we hear from Neil and how he's actually dealing with water on his farm. I think sketching some of these out, even if it's just on a piece of paper and you're just drawing a visual map of your farm, can be really useful to start to think about the ways that you're already dealing with some of these things and identify those low-hanging fruit that looking at just a spreadsheet can be a little daunting. So that's a useful way to think about this. And I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Awesome. Okay, we have two maps.
I can show that.
Yeah, let's look at those first.
Okay. Yeah, so here's a couple of maps of East 40 Farm. Very steep site, about 130, 140 foot elevation change over the course of this, running down to the water. And here's that same flow accumulation analysis of this farm. You can see the channels that start to get created and the stronger channels that move through there as it gets closer to the water. We'll hear from Neil here how he is dealing with drainage on this rather steep site.
Yeah, I'd never actually seen that drainage map, so I'm gonna have to get a copy of that. That's great because
We just did that for you.
they,
Emily get that to you.
it's accurately identified some of the absolute problems and problem areas. So that's great.
Great.
I'm gonna pull up my thing here. Oh, come on. All right. Okay, I'm Neil Foley. I farm at East 40 Farm in Waldoboro, Maine, with my wife, Allison. Oh, that's me, and Libby, the cow. That's my wife, Allison. She's cheesemaker. We make cheese, Lagan's Gorgeous cheese here on the farm from the milk from the Jerseys. Some of the cheese babies. Because we use all the milk as in the cheese, we don't have to have a particularly huge herd because of the value added, so we can keep things kind of tight, high, and productive. We also raise pork, beef, and veal. But there's that land. This is my topographic map. We run from the break in the valley. There's two valleys, and the highest point of the farm is at the peak of both valleys, and then we run down to Long Cove River and the river, the Madomic River. And within that, in this image, there's the two blue lines are actually two running streams, or actually the first one closest to the silvopasture areas there. I actually have built a bridge over that because it was flooding so badly from treatment from previous owners. And obviously we have the field at the top of the property, and then down below, the property is kind of divided into 3 terraces. So for such a steep property, the main field is a low, gentle slope, and then there's a really sharp slope, and then sort of a level terrace, and then it gets steeper, and then down towards the water in the forest. It gets steep in a couple sections, but it's sort of terraced again. So we created silvopastures sort of in the middle of the property to help deal with the drought, because when we moved here, drought was our main concern. We bought the property in 2016, or actually moved here. We leased the property from Dirt Capital Partners, and we're trying to buy it out this year. So we'd had nothing but droughts during the summers. And then all of a sudden, the fall of 2016, we got an eye opener because it rained nonstop. They had sold us the property and didn't tell us that one of the roofs leaked, and we didn't know it leaked because it hadn't rained for months. So we built a custom cheese facility here to make the cheese, and then I also operate a sawmill, and I chose this area to be at below the main field, one of the second terraces, because it was so full of stone that I decided it couldn't be used for hay. It couldn't be easily worked with any equipment. And, grazing was minimal because it was full of brush. And so set the sawmill up, get production, get some income going. But it turns out that as that hydrology chart shows, all the water pumping out of the field flooded this little 2-acre plot to the point of perching the soil. I didn't even know that was a thing, making the soil so saturated that oops, not too far. So saturated that happened, that it became pudding and became virtually unusable. So this is before the climate mitigation programs had started. This was back in, I think this picture was in 2018. So we went to NRCS and said, hey, what can you do? And they, at their glacial pace, helped us install a massive French drain. And I will say that drainage is the best investment in your farm. I'm planning to do a lot more. It lasts for decades, and putting it in today is going to be cheaper than putting it in tomorrow, and you're going to have drier land and be able to transport water to where you need it to be. So we got that drainage in, and we decided to take an area that was low-lying and stony, had some big glacial boulders in it, and turn it into this pond. Mainly, in my mind, I was viewing this as maybe some fire protection, because I was still in this drought mindset. We kept having these droughts every summer. And then also, emergency water because of the droughts for watering cattle, for watering anything, but then also just to hold the water and to create a wildlife habitat, because this picture was taken. I dug the pond and finished the drainage during the drought, and then one day it rained and the pond filled up like that just from one rain. And within a week, wildlife had moved in, and it became an immediate habitat, which was pretty cool. This is the map I was working off of from NRCS to help the grade, and kind of given the schedule of the work. And this is one of the other problems we realized, because when it did get wet, that had been a farm road. But obviously, in the 250 years that this has been a farm, and then that's been a farm road, it had never been really improved much, or the climate was such that it was stable enough under most circumstances. But then as everything got wetter, it just turned to soup. So we actually ended up getting some assistance from NRCS doing that. And then here's where things changed. Back in 2020, it rained, and we had another micro drought, and it rained most of October and November, to the point that temporary fence posts wouldn't even stay in the ground. And I'd never experienced that. Pigs went everywhere. It was a nightmare. We were chasing livestock all over the farm all the time, continually. And so we sort of got out of that. But as we planned things and had built the new heavy use area, covered manure storage, which we're using as a barn, the area outside that barn, we had been able to overwinter the cows until this was the winter of 24. I had been feeding the cows in there, and there's 3 feet of water on that hay rake. Unfortunately, I was able to pump it down slope and get it out of there, and actually put all that effluent water, because I was trying to keep it on our farm butts the Madomic River, which is the single largest, most productive clam flat in the state. And I'll be damned if I'm going to be the one that gets that shut down because of some kind of nitrogen bloom. So I've left a lot of buffer area down slope to help absorb any kind of runoff. And so that's also why we put in that French drain and the farm pond that collects all the clean water coming off of roofs and gutters, and anything like that stays clean and gets out of the barnyard and down slope and is held in that pond, and then trickles out into the landscape clean from there. Whereas here, I put it in, I have a grassed treatment area, buffer strip treatment area that I was pumping this kind of effluenty sludge onto. It's actually some of the best grass on the farm, but we can't graze animals there, thanks to NRCS. But this is what we found happened, that the areas, winters got warmer, areas where we had been outwintering cows and feeding them, all of a sudden became like
it
this.
turns to soup, and it runs out of the barnyard. And you can see
really
the standing
gross.
water back there behind Lana, and
And,
just pumps
just not tenable. So we also got some NRCS funds to stone the main road down to the forest and through the farm, which had a huge benefit because we were able to ease the grade. This area on the photo on the left, looking up the hill, that had a really abrupt drop to it, so much so that it was really hard for cows to get up it, for tractors to climb it. So we put in a lot of, big stone, build it, ferret it out, added little stone. Now this does become a little bit of a highway for water coming down the hill. So I still have some work to do to create some drainage on that. But the corollary to having stone roads is once you stone your pathways, and this is the NRCS gave us some funds to build a trail and walkway from the barnyard and the milking parlor out to the main field. This again had been heavily sloped. So on the right side of the image, of the left image, looking out to the field, the stone is probably 2 feet deep on the lower side, and it feathers out to about 6 inches deep on the uphill side, just to try and give that some kind of levelness. Because trying to get the cows in and out of the field before that happened, I remember one muddy night where we were all sliding and falling, trying to get from the field. It was incredibly dangerous. I fell under a cow. Lucky I didn't get stepped on worse than I did. So that was just one of those autumn heavy now more often it happens than not in October, November, we get these deluges after a fairly dry summer. And that again, it turned into pudding and was almost impassable. So then here's the bridge I built down below, 10 RCS spec.
So come around the bridge.
Yeah, don't mind my narration. That was for a video for something else.
Here,
it has about
concrete abutments,
5 foot high water mark
on top of a bed of crushed rock.
Fortunately, we haven't come close to that yet. It was designed for
slope,
heavy water.
Both inner sides
filmed during a drought, so there was barely anything running.
The bank was rip-wrapped. It's grown over to help shore it up. So that was all put in last year, and then this summer I started
that had been filled in with logs and debris from previous owners and had flooded and just continually made that whole area unusable. That's about the middle of the property, so there's still quite a ways to go, and a wood that I want to develop it's mostly oak, so I want to be able to graze the pigs in there, but I needed a good way to get the livestock through that wet area, so we put in the bridge. This book, Water in Plain Sight, if you've never heard about it, it is great. It comes as an audio book, which is how I consumed it. Judith Schwartz also wrote a book about grazing. But this really opened my mind to the need for water and the need to keep clean water clean and dirty water dirty, and not to mix the two. And that it also changed how I graze, because we were set up for droughts. And I know this is about flooding, but the whole idea is we need to keep water where it falls as much as possible. And that's whether you use a cover crop to keep the ground clad, or drop residue on a grazing field after it's been grazed and top it, to keep that moisture where it falls in place. And so I've even gone on dry summers to moving the water where the cows are rotationally grazing, running lines, bringing troughs out every day, moving the water so that they're not carrying what they drink back to the barn and peeing it out where it gets wasted. I want those nutrients and that liquid to stay where it needs to be. And this book was really, I stopped burning brush piles because reading how burning and the removal of trees and clearing land also affects the water flow when you wouldn't necessarily think that. Now with the NRCS grants that we got from doing the climate adaptation plan, one of the things I discovered or identified, a problem I identified was this end of the barn where the cows were coming in and out of that stone area of the field, but then having to walk up the road and then come up a hill that was parallel with the barn. And so what I did was to disrupt the flow of water down the hill and also any effluent coming out of that barn floor. I made this ramp perpendicular to the barn and created a terrace. So it's just a stone road. Eventually, hopefully, I'll concrete it because it's hard to clean the manure off the stone, obviously. But then I've used, let's see if this is going to play. I didn't have a good view of the stonework. Great terrace. But that, those concrete blocks help break this hillside up. I terraced that in a couple of stages. And now what I can do is I park, this year I just dumped the manure over the end because there was no way to get around as wet as it was and as much snow as we had. But I can park a manure spreader there and clean the barn and the bedded pack right out into the manure spreader. So it was kind of designed with multiple, to make life easier in multiple ways. And then this is just me.
Definitely not a day I choose to be outside and working. Be nice. It's 52, it's warmish, but it'd be nice to be inside, curled up next to the heater, because it is a cold, damp 52. I'm down here feeding the pigs. I gotta get a couple of these round bales brought up. It's really muddy. The amount of rain that's fallen is in excess of a couple inches already. Once again, the mud road has turned to ice. I mean, not literal ice, but grease. It's just slick as can be. And yeah, got to do this anyway.
So the mud for us is the biggest concern. I mean, we can clad the ground with stone or keep cropping, on top of the ground to keep open soil covered. But anywhere you have to drive that creates mud, that mud, and for us being a dairy, that mud also includes manure. It just spreads everywhere, and it's hard on equipment. And it also, the more water that falls from the sky, you actually kind of have to use a lot more water to clean things and get mud off of stuff and just keep things sanitary. So we're trying to find a way to afford stoning anywhere that vehicles go, the skid steer, the tractors, create those stone roadways so that the soil isn't brought up and mixed with manure. And then having to, especially in the winter, if you have any track machines, you have to clean that out daily. Anytime you get mud in the tracks of a skid steer, has to be washed off daily, or it freezes like concrete and the machine becomes immobile. And if you use it every day, you have to do that. So that's the slides I got.
Thanks, Neil. I think you can stop sharing, and I'm just gonna ask you some questions about, there we go, about the climate adaptation planning process, and you can just tell us what you think about it. So first one is, when did you start thinking about adapting to climate change, and what made you start thinking about climate planning explicitly?
We started thinking about climate immediately when we got this property in 2016, because we've been at a drought, and I gambled a lot of money to take the field and plant it, even though we were in a drought. And I just fingers crossed that it was gonna rain. And that gamble paid off that year. I don't know if I gambled this year and overseeded that same field. It really needed to have been done a couple years ago, but it was too wet here a couple years ago. So at the end of the drought this year, I overseeded it, and then it didn't rain. So in December, when I did my field walks and my soil sampling for the PASA study we're in, I was grateful to see tiny little seedlings in the trenches left by the no-till seeder. And they're still out there now. So at least some percentage of that survived what has been an incredibly hard and cold winter. So, and what I've, now that we're in this climate adaptation planning process, it's endless. It's ongoing constantly. We got started with NRCS because of drought. We went with the climate mitigation adaptation plan because of too much rain all of a sudden. And then this winter has thrown us a curveball. We had more snow here this winter than we've had in 6 years put together. And so totally not prepared for that. We are a windy site, but we've had more wind here this year with colder temperatures and vicious wind chills than I think I can remember in the sort of 9-10 years we've been here. So again, now I've got a new set of things I need to adapt to. What happens in those occurrences? One thing I had no idea, I oriented a wood boiler to the west because it was convenient. We had about a 35-mile-an-hour west wind blowing at that wood boiler, and it overfired because of the wind pressure. Not even considered that could happen. So you live and learn, and you adapt, and you work through that sheet, you glance at it, you say, okay, yeah, what do? I have hydrological soils that really, I'd wanted to get this tool, this aeration tool that has these big fins on it that is supposed to fracture the ground and increase drainage and break up field compaction. I really want to trial that on our soils because we're so stony here that a subsoiler doesn't really work. It just pulls up too much stone and makes a mess of everything. So to get some, and I know I have to do some more drainage, definitely. I mean, that is a big plan here, is to try and fund and go forward with drainage, because that is the most long lasting thing. But yeah, it's ongoing.
Great. What resources have you used, and what resources have been the most helpful?
Certainly NRCS, but I know how helpful that has been. I don't know. They're slow and tedious, and when you need to do things, they're not around. I found. Now there are some, and I've been told, and maybe in other states, maybe certainly in Vermont, because I know Sara and one of our other advisors have said, oh, how come you don't do this? I'm like, yeah, right. My NRCS rep is sort of bare bones. There's some programs that if your field does wash away, you can apply for this emergency money to help shore up, an eroding field or a road that's washed out. But I've never been able to see any of that, because I did have a road washout one year, and I asked them for some help, and they said, yeah, well, apply for the next round of EQIP, and we'll go from there 2 or 3 years down the road. So I've taken to relying on advisors, MFT, MOFGA, Sara Flack, and I actually, because of the last 2 or 3 winters, and we can't out winter cows on ground anymore. It's much too soft. The ground never really freezes solid, except for this last year. We've redesigned where the new milking parlor is going to go. We've shifted some things. We've increased the size of concrete pads and buildings, and that's largely been thankful that we've had some great advisors now to help say, oh yeah, Sara Flack was here and said, oh yeah, you're not 100% organic, so you can keep your cows in if they have to be in. I mean, why go through the hassle of outwintering them and giving them free access to mud when you don't have to? So that was, that was like, oh, okay, yeah, right, all right, let's think about that. And then also just using the resources online and the planning tools, just to kind of, you take photos and say, okay, is there something else we could be doing different?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What has the biggest lesson you have learned from the planning process been so far?
You can never think big enough. You know, yeah, okay, so I've got a little spring that pumps out of one corner of the field every year. What do I do with it? Well, that is actually the symptom of a much larger issue. And then like we put in that walkway to the field for the cows. That has created a different issue because I didn't think big enough. I didn't say, okay, well, let's go to the hydrology. Let's go to that drainage map. And like, you know, the road intercepts and changed the landscape. And now I have water in a whole different spot, causing a whole different problem. Putting in that pond and taking all that drainage from the barnyard and putting it in there. NRCS doesn't offer any advice on ponds, so that was on me. They just wanted to spill it out on the ground, and I'm thankful that I didn't do that, because at one point in the winter of 24, the column of water I found shooting out of the overflow drain on the pond was going out about 20 feet as a 6-inch column of water being shot out into the field below. And it's just a flooded mess. And so that's one of those issues I identified through doing the mitigation plan, was saying, okay, I need to put a drainage swale in there. I need to have some way so that when that happens, the water doesn't go all across the field. It's carried in a specific area and can get out, you know, the best way possible. But again, I didn't think big enough. I didn't consider that next step, you know, where does it go? What happens next? We have to happen next. So plan big.
Last question. What's next in your adaptation planning journey? Or what are you excited about doing in the future?
Well, I'm really excited. I really wanted to get that roller, but I haven't pulled that together. I needed to get some grants together and I couldn't do that. So I'm probably going to work on that hydro swale this spring. I want to see, and again, now, you know, maybe I'm still waiting. I've been waiting for a year now for my new nutrient management plan, comprehensive nutrient management plan, to be finished. So I can't even get the next round of NRCS, even if that exists in the future. So I'm just going to work and think, okay, here's NRCS designs. We have all those designs accessible to us. So how can I apply those designs without the grant money and make them work? You know, can I use any number of the huge stone piles here rather than importing stone and drainage rock and stuff? Can I mine some of these big stone piles and make a French drain basically in a couple spots? You know, at least it's only cost me time. If NRCS gives me some money down the road or something changes, I can rip them out and it hasn't cost me anything but my time and a little bit of diesel maybe. So you kind of have to think that way too. Are there things, prioritize, are there things that I can do now that will help, that are inexpensive? Do I have the resources here? Or do I have to budget that project and buy drain tile, or do I want to go that next step? Is this really something that now I'm starting to ask, are these really things that I want to be ground to a halt by the NRCS process? As good as they are and as great as that help is, and the advisors are fantastic. We've got such a great team here on the farm of NRCS advisors. I hate to see that, you know, kind of fade away, but also on the flip side, a lot of why we're in the position we are in is because we did go with NRCS and we have been held up by their glacial pace. So on some things, I don't think it's even worth asking for NRCS help for, because if it's an immediate concern, you have to address it immediately.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Oh, sorry, Sara.
One more thing. Oh, Neil, go ahead.
No, if anybody has any questions, happy to.
Okay. I was just going to say, bonus, Emily is here, who worked with Emily. Neil on the climate adaptation plan. So Emily, unplanned, but if you have any reflections on the climate adaptation planning process that you want to share, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Neil, what an awesome presentation. I can't say I'm surprised just because you're always so on it with being able to share out what's going on the farm. I think the only thing that I'd share is from the service provider perspective, just letting the farmer direct the course of the climate adaptation planning process. Neil's situation was unique that when I came on to work with him, he had actually already developed a climate adaptation plan with MFT. So we just went on and adapted from there, of what was now happening on the farm, and to have that be a reiterative process and not ever a final document but a working document, was really a really awesome experience for me, and I think a lot more applicable and realistic for Neil. um, yeah, so it's I'm always excited to see what Neil's got cooking up, especially in the barnyard area.
I just wanted to quickly mention that we're going to send out that poll of a valuation of this session. And there was one question that came in, probably more for the service providers. Although, Neil, if you had any feedback on this, this would be interesting to hear your take. Is there a way to preserve salt marsh from falling into a river? It's a buffer to our forest.
Well, we abut onto a salt marsh. I think the key is to not disturb it. That's, the river's going to change course and do what it does. And as the water table and high tide gets higher in the rivers, it's kind of one of those, what happens. We've lost about 3 feet of our shore bank along the river due to some very violent winter storms a few years back. So I also, it's one of those areas where we don't go that often. I've sort of developed the farm in thirds: the farmyard and the field, and then the silvopasture, and then the forest, and the river's down on the forest end. So I don't even go there that often. But if we had to, I would definitely be planting some things to hold the bank back, natural ground covers and stuff. Our site has been in use for 250 years, and there were boatways down on the river and things that are cobbled that have been covered with mud and exposed occasionally, and say, oh wow, look at that, this was much farther back, so obviously the bank had collapsed and covered part of that part of the marsh, but it had been used for commerce once upon a time. But yeah, salt marshes are that weird thing, the less you disturb them, the more hardy they can be.
Yeah, I think I would just second that. It's like thinking about what the land wants to do naturally and where it's been manipulated that might be causing the issues, and how to try to prevent the disturbance. But that's a tough one.
Any other questions that folks have for either Sean, Neil, or Sarah before we wrap up tonight?
I'll just jump in with one comment, just with Neil, you reminded me of it in terms of how you thought about your farm. A lot of the adaptation process can be this kind of broad thinking and brainstorming process to think about what's possible, and then also where are you going to need the additional resources, right? So this isn't necessarily here's exactly what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it, but where do I need to figure out who can help me do this, and what are the technical service providers that I can find to help me get specific on certain practices. So this is kind of that first step in figuring that all out.
Well, great. I really appreciate everyone showing up tonight, and we'll follow up with some of the resources mentioned in these forums, as well as a recording of all 3 of the sessions. Yeah, and feel free to reach out to any of us service providers with any questions or needs that you have. Look forward to working with you guys all in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Neil.
You bet.
That was
Thanks,
fun.
Neil. It was great.
Yeah, it seemed to be well received. It was great information. Sarah, yours and Sean's thing were great.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the 3 of us are a pretty good team, Neil.
Yeah. You should do more.
Yep.
I've got somebody's coming to the farm on the 28th, right? Is that you guys or somebody else?
I don't know.
I don't know.
AFT and MFT, which farmland trust are we talking about?